Twilight Struggle might be the best game I have ever played. It's not a super complicated game, but it will take some time to learn. I'm going to walk you through the digital tutorial provided in the Twilight Struggle app by Playdeck. This is Legendary Tactics. Today we're going to walk through the digital tutorial for the game Twilight Struggle. This is an amazing game and well worth the investment of learning how to play, although it will take us a few minutes here. This game is about the Cold War between the USA and the USSR. It's played over 10 turns, and to win you need to get to 20 victory points, or at the end of the game end up with more victory points than your opponent. So in this tutorial we're going to play as the USA, and our AI opponent is going to play as the USSR. At the start of each turn, we're going to be dealt a hand of cards. For the first turn, you get 8 cards to start. And to look at each card has an operations value in the top left, okay? And there's also a text there that's an event that can be played. And there are events that are US events. They have the white star. There are other events that are going to be Soviet events or USSR events. Those have the red star. And there are those which are neutral events, which have a combination white and red star. Now we begin in the early war. We have 8 cards in hand and 6 action rounds. Okay, so that means that there's going to be 1 card that is used in the headline phase, which we're going to cover in a second. You play 6 cards from your hand and you get to hang on to one of them, generally speaking. So we move on to the headline phase. And this is one of the unique aspects of Twilight Struggle that I really like. It's a really interesting mechanic. So the first phase of every turn is called the headline phase. And each player chooses a card secretly to play face down and reveal at the same time. Now we're going to choose Marshall Plan as the headline event. And so in this interface, we drag and drop it into the headline box here. And it moves over to the side and both cards get flipped up. Our opponent headlined Comic-Con. So in this case, the operations values are compared, and whoever has the highest operations value plays their event first. You never take or very rarely take operations in the headline phase. It is only playing the event, so that's very important. Generally, you're not going to be playing your opponent's events at this stage of the game. You want to choose something that's favorable to you. So the Marshall Plan event allows us to place 7 influence onto the board, and we can place that into any country in Western Europe that the USSR doesn't control, and each country only gains 1 influence. Now I know there's some terminology there that you're not familiar with. We're going to cover that right now. So if you look at Europe, which is the purple zone here, it's divided into 2 subregions. Countries in Western Europe are shaded dark purple on the map. Eastern Europe is shaded light purple. And please note that Canada is considered to be Western Europe on this map. And it's a bit of a subtle difference, but you should be able to see the color difference there. Austria and Finland are considered to be in both Western and Eastern Europe, and so they're shaded both colors. And if an event allows you to play influence into either Eastern or Western Europe, you can always place in Austria and Finland. So we're going to place 1 influence in Turkey. Now, I'm just going to highlight here that Turkey has 2 stability. So when I place an influence here, it matches the stability number. So I have an edge in that of 2-0 over my opponent, the USSR. The USA is blue in this case. And so that allows me to control this country, and that's why it flipped to the darker color. If you look at Greece, for example, I only have 1 influence there. I need 2 more than my opponent in order to control this. Yugoslavia needs 3 more, so the USSR would have to invest 2 more influence into Yugoslavia in order to control it. UK is 5. So just to gain control of this country, the USSR would need to put 10 influence into the UK. So the UK is very stable that way. So once you have that control, then it flips over and it can be used for things like scoring and so forth. So when we look at some other examples here, so in Peru with 1 US influence, there's no control. The stability is not matched. However, 1 additional influence would allow you to control Peru. Now, in the bottom left example, 2-1, you need to have 2 more than your opponents. So the U.S. does not control Peru even if they have more influence there. It's only when the third influence is placed that control is maintained. So we're going to place an influence in Greece here and one in Italy just to shore that up. You can have more influence than you need to control. It's called over-controlling a country. And sometimes that's useful just to scare off your opponents and make it harder for them to take over that country with their influence. And we're going to play in France, and we're going to play in Benelux and Spain. So this event is great. It allows us to place a lot of influence. So now that effect is complete, and once a card is played for either events or operations points, it's put into the discard piles discard pile afterwards. However, in this case, if you look, Marshall Plan has an asterisk, a star beside it, which means that if you play it for the event, after the event is resolved, the card is removed from the game and it never comes back until the next game. Whenever the draw pile is out of cards, the discard pile will be reshuffled to form a new draw pile. However, if a card is removed from the game, it will not be included in that reshuffle. Okay, so that card is now removed entirely from play. Comic-Con is played. Our opponent places some influence into Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And so if you look at the card as well, it is also a starred event, so it is removed from play after it is resolved. Now, after both players have played their headline card, the headline phase is over. The next phase is action rounds, and the players basically alternate playing one card each for 6 action rounds, and the USSR always takes the first action round. So the USSR is up first here and plays this card for influence, which means they take the 2 operations points and they can place influence on the board. So this essentially means that they've chosen not to take the event and instead take 2 operations points, placing influence, which has to be placed adjacent to either the USSR itself or where they already have influence. You can't just place influence anywhere you like on the board. So when placing the influence points here, you can see they want to get into Italy because they already have some influence in Austria and Yugoslavia, which are next door. If you look very carefully in the map, you can see these lines that are connecting the countries together, and those lines have to be followed. Those countries are considered to be adjacent. So, for example, the UK is adjacent to France, Benelux, and Norway. And so those lines are really important. They give kind of the map. They give the map a kind of integration, and it's not meant to be necessarily that they're geographically connected, but more politically and economically connected. So normally, placing an influence, you can place 1 influence per operations point that you spend. However, if you're playing it into a country that your opponent controls, it costs 2 operations points to place that 1 influence. So in other words, playing it, if the USSR plays into Italy, the both of the operations points that are provided by the Indo-Pakistani War are used up entirely to place the 1 influence into Italy, and then that's the end of the action round. And in this case, it didn't even switch control or break my control of Italy because I still have 2 more influence than the USSR. And so because this card was used for the operations points, it goes onto the discard pile and can be reshuffled in. Now we get our first action round, and we've got some cards which are associated with our opponent, specifically Fidel, Arab-Israeli War, and captured Romanian abdication are the 3 USSR events. The 2 neutral events we have are captured Nazi scientists, Olympic Games. We have a scoring card, which is Europe scoring, which we'll touch on, and we have an event of our own, U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Pact, which is a starred event and provides 4 operations points if we choose not to take the event. Okay, so now one of the neat one of the neat mechanisms of this game is that if we play an event that is the opponent's event, then that event happens. We have no choice. So, for example, when I play Romanian abdication, that event is going to happen either before or after I take the operations points. And as the person playing the card, I get to choose whether it happens before or after my operations points. So, just looking at the map, I may want to attempt a coup to improve my position. One of the uses of the operations points is just placing influence, but another use of it is to attempt a coup. And this is where all the operations points on a card are spent in a single target country, where in this case our opponent has influence. And the lower the stability number of the country, the more likely it is that the coup attempt will succeed. And that's kind of reflective of, general, the stability of the government in general. Obviously, in this case, the UK with stability 5 is going to be very tough to coup. When in this case, we're going to play Fidel, and we're going to choose to take the operations first to attempt a coup. And we're going to attempt a coup in Syria. Now, Syria has a stability number of 2, which is, not the lowest possible, but it's reasonably low. So we're going to pick this one as the target for our coup. So we get a little summary on the digital version of what the situation is with regard to the coup. They can be dangerous, as you'll see. So in this case, the DEFCON status will remain at 5, and again, I'll go into that. The coup defense is 4, so you take the stability number and double it, and that becomes what they call the coup defense, and it shows the result preview. So it says on a 1 or 2, nothing changes. On a 3, the USSR influence will be removed. On a 4, it'll actually flip to 1 US influence. 5 and 6 are obviously great for us. And so what happens with this is that we take the operations point value of the card, we add it to the die roll, and then whatever that die roll is, combined with the operations points, it flips the influence in that space. So I know that was a bit unclear, but essentially, if we look at an example here, so the coup defense is 4, right? So if we spend 2 operations points and we roll a 1, that's 3. It's not enough to make a change. 2 and 2 is 0. So again, not enough to make a change. However, 2 and 3 is 5. The difference between the coup defense and the roll, the coup itself, is 5 to 4, so it's 1. So we would flip the influence 1 level or 1 influence towards the side conducting the coup. So if it's a 6, for example, 2 plus 6 is 8, minus the 4 coup defense means it flips 4. So the 1 influence is removed from the USSR in Syria, and 3 is added by the US. Once you do a couple of these, you'll see exactly how it works. So essentially, as it says here, your opponent must remove influence equal to the difference between the values of the coup defense and the coup attempt. If the difference is greater than your opponent's influence, then the remainder will be added to your influence. So we're going to click and go on the coup attempt. We roll a 4, so we get some luck. So the 2 plus the 4 is 6. The coup defense was 4, so the influence swing. We remove the 1 Soviet influence and add 1 US influence as a result. Okay, so because that was the only reason that really worked was because the influence that the USSR had there was fairly weak. So as it says here, we succeeded by a margin of 2, but your opponent only has 1 influence in Syria. The remaining difference is instead used to add your influence to the country. So Syria is left with 0 USSR influence and 1 US influence. Now, each turn, to avoid a victory point penalty, both players must conduct military operations. Now, coups add to your military operations for the turn, and you gain the number of operations points used for the coup attempt. So we now have 2 military operations points, or we shorten it to mil ops points. At the end of the turn, if you have fewer military operations than the DEFCON status, which is from 5 to 1, although 1 is World War III, so it's not used very often, then we lose the difference in victory points. So you need to either gain 3 or more MilOps points or lower the DEFCON status before the turn ends. And we'll cover that a little bit more. So now that we've finished using the operations points for the coup attempt, our opponent gets to play the Fidel event because we chose to take the event after our operations points. And so the opponent event happens and it places 3 influence in Cuba. And now Cuba is controlled by the USSR. Now, because the event happened and Fidel is a starred event, it will be removed from the game, even though it was the US player in this case playing it. Now, the USSR actually plays one of our events and takes the influence first and just places 2 influence, one in Iran and one in France. Okay, so that's very straightforward turn. I think we've covered that. Now we get the event, and so after they use the operations points, we take advantage of the event where we can match USSR influence in either Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia. And so we're going to pick Yugoslavia for this. And so we match their influence there. Now, the scoring in Twilight Struggle happens with scoring cards. Now, we have a scoring card in hand, the Europe scoring, and they must be played in the same turn that you draw them. They cannot be held over to the next turn. If you recall, I said earlier that there's going to be likely 1 card held this turn or most turns. But scoring cards must be played, and this gives you a little pressure and that you have to try and make sure that the scoring situation in a region is not too terrible before you play it, because it could cost you a lot of points or even the game in some cases. So if you find yourself with a scoring card in your hand after all the action rounds have been played, you immediately lose the game. Now, when played, Europe scoring gives points to each side based on their strength in the region according to the card. So basically to specify, there are 2 types of countries on the board. There's one type of country called a battleground and one that's called a non-battleground. And the battleground countries have a red background behind the country name. The non-battleground countries have a darker region color background. And the idea behind this is that a battleground country historically was very impactful with regard to the Cold War, whereas a non-battleground country had less involvement in the Cold War, or just was less geographically or economically impactful compared to other countries. So it's not a reflection on the countries themselves. So if you look here, it says on the scoring card that the Europe scoring card, both sides score for presence. They can score domination or control. And these are really important concepts here. So presence just requires that either side, the US or the USSR, has control of one country in that region. So in this case, both sides would have presence in Europe because both countries control at least one country in Europe. Just to look here. So the U.S. controls 5 countries in Europe, and so we'd qualify for presence and gain 3 victory points. The USSR also has control of at least one country, so they qualify for 3 victory points. So it's a wash. Basically, it's a net 0. To qualify for domination, you need to control more total countries and more battleground countries in a region than your opponent does. And in addition, you must control at least 1 non-battleground country. So you can't just have all the battleground countries and you control 3 and your opponent controls 2. You must also have control of at least 1 non-battleground country in a region. So if we look at the situation in Europe, each side has 2 battleground countries under their control. So it's a wash in this case. Neither side can claim domination. However, if the U.S. had something like France, they would actually claim domination because they have more control of more battlegrounds in that case, and at least one non-battleground country. And then to qualify for control, which is hard to get, you need to control more total countries and control all of the battleground countries in the region. So that's something that, if you'll note, there's no mention of non-battleground countries in that case. So, but you need to control more total countries and all of the battlegrounds in that case. It's, again, pretty tough to get. Now, Europe is special. Typically, control just gives you a lot more victory points, but controlling Europe actually will result in an automatic win for the player that has control. And there's also a few other sort of bonuses. So for every battleground country in a region that you control, you get an extra victory point. And so in this case, so we control two battlegrounds, and so we'd gain 2 victory points along with the 3 for presence. And finally, any regions that are controlled that are adjacent to the enemy superpower are worth 1 additional victory point. So in Europe, we have Poland, Finland, and Romania are adjacent to the USSR, but as the US, we don't control any of those countries. And again, just refer to these lines here that are connecting the countries to figure out adjacency. So for example, Turkey is not adjacent to the USSR, neither is Czechoslovakia. Canada, again, is next to the US, obviously. The USSR does not control it, so there's no victory points awarded for that adjacent country. And so if we add up our score for the current state of Europe, there's 5 victory points, 3 for presence and 2 for battleground countries. The USSR gains 5 VPs as well for presence and control of 2 battleground countries. So the final result of playing Europe scoring during this action round would be even, 0, and the victory point track would stay at 0. The victory point track is here at the top, right in the center. And since you have to play Europe scoring during this turn, you want to gain as many points as possible for it, and domination of the region is the best way to do that. So with France being the last uncontrolled battleground, this one would be the key to getting domination of the region. And so we could attempt a coup here since the opponent has influence, but it's France has a 3 for stability, which is reasonably high. Its coup defense will be double that, which is 6. So it's a bit hard to get a good, we'd have to get a great roll to make something happen there. So the safest routes would be to just place enough influence in France to control it. So we're going to take the 4 operations points from the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact, and we're going to place 3 influence in France. And that's perfect. We now control France and qualify for domination in Europe because we have 3 battleground countries, West Germany, Italy, and France. And we also have control of the UK, Greece, and Turkey as well for non-battlegrounds. So the USSR does have an action round to respond, though, so we'll see what they get up to. Now, we still have 1 other operations point left, so we're going to place it in a different region. We're going to place it in Lebanon. Lebanon has stability 1, so we actually control it just with 1 influence, as you can see. So the USSR takes a coup against France and rolls a 1. So 2 plus 1 is 3. It's not enough to overcome the defense, which is, again, double the stability number, which is 6. So the coup was ineffective. Now, because he couped a battleground country, which is France, the DEFCON will degrade to 4. So this is something that is really important here. So DEFCON went from 5, which is peaceful, to 4. So it ramped up. We're a bit the tensions are mounting, and we're a bit closer to potentially World War III. So any coup attempt in a battleground country will automatically lower the DEFCON status by 1. Keep a close eye on the DEFCON status, because if it reaches 1 during your action round, you will lose the game. And this can happen. There's a few concepts that you'll need to know about. There's a few dangerous cards that can lower DEFCON status on you. And even if it happens, even if your opponent does it, if it happens on your turn, then you lose the game. So as DEFCON status gets lower, more of the map becomes off limits to coup and realignment attempts. We haven't talked about realignments yet, but we will. Now that we're at DEFCON 4, Europe is restricted. So that means that there is no coups or realignments allowed in Europe. And that's because the tensions are rising. And so we went to DEFCON 4, which means that it's now off limits. And in this case, the coup attempt also granted 2 military operations points to the USSR. And so remember that you lose victory points when you compare the DEFCON status track to the number of military operations that you took, the number of operations points you spent on things like coups throughout the turn. So if the turn ended right now, both players would lose 2 victory points since you each have 2 military ops points and the DEFCON status is at 4. So you'll need to gain some mil ops points or else further lower the DEFCON status to avoid this penalty. Now, if you both lose 2 victory points, it's a wash, so it doesn't matter necessarily, but anyway, it is something to consider. So the opponent used Vietnam revolts for the operations points. So even though it was a starred event, it will be placed in the discard pile because the event was not played. So if we click on continue here, we move on to our third action round. Now, the Soviet coup in France failed to work, so we can play Europe scoring for the big score here. And it gives us a nice scoring breakdown. So we have domination, which is worth 7. Our opponent has 3 for presence. When we add up the battleground countries we control 3. Our opponent controls 2. So this is worth 5 victory points for us, which is the differential between the amount that we score minus the amount that our opponent scores. So this is worth 5 victory points for us, which is pretty good at this stage of the game. So we will take that. This button, if you're playing online, this is the commit button. So once you click on this, it commits a card to play. You can't undo at that point. And we gain 5 victory points. And we need just 15 more victory points to win the game. Now our opponent will play Warsaw Pact formed for the event and place a bunch of influence in Eastern Europe. And basically they're gaining control of some countries and solidifying things over there, which is great. And we get our next turn. Now, realignments are often misunderstood as an action, but I'm hoping to clarify them a bit here. So for each ops point you spend, you can make 1 roll to remove influence in a country, provided that country isn't restricted by the DEFCON status. And so it will remove influence. It will not place influence. And just a little bit about the DEFCON restrictions there. At DEFCON 4, you can't coup or realign in Europe. At DEFCON 3, you can't coup or realign in Europe or Asia. And at DEFCON 2, the Middle East is also closed to realignments and coups. You can coup in other countries, Central, South America, Africa. However, if you coup a battleground country, DEFCON 2, it will lower the DEFCON to 1 and lose you the game. But it'll touch on that in a little bit. So we're going to play Olympic Games, and we're going to attempt a realignment in Cuba. So we're going to pick Cuba. Now, with Cuba, because it's next to the U.S., there's a modifier of +1. And because the Soviets have more influence there, it's +1. Now go into the modifiers here. So it's 1 6-sided die that you roll per ops point spent. And whichever side rolls higher can remove the difference in influence from the country. And they can never add influence. So in this case, you can see the modifiers cancel out. So it's a 58.3% chance of nothing happening, 13.9% chance of losing USSR losing 1 influence, all the way to 16.7% chance of losing it all. So now the modifiers do affect this greatly. So once again, if whoever has more influence in the country gets a +1, and each adjacent country that is controlled by that player gives +1. And so the U.S. counts as being under U.S. control. So that's why it gets +1. So generally speaking, before you do a realignment, you want to try and have some neighboring countries to increase the modifier to increase your odds of actually succeeding. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that if you have both players' influence in a country, either player can lose influence. So it's not like a coup where you're safe and guaranteed not to lose influence. With realignment rolls, you might actually end up wiping out your own influence, which is kind of important to remember. So we're going to roll the die, and we roll 4 to 3. So that difference is then 1, even with all the modifiers. So the USSR influence in Cuba drops by 1 to 2. So that breaks the control of Cuba anyway, but that influence can then be replaced at a later point. So we have one more realignment attempt remaining because there was 2 ops with Olympic Games, so we get a second roll. And let's see if we can finish the job here. It's the same odds and everything, so or same modifiers. So let's see. And we happen to roll really, really well. We roll a 5 to 2. The difference is 3, so the USSR loses 3 influence. There's only 2 present, so both influence are removed from Cuba, which is great. We accomplished what we wanted to. And again, realignments are not used as often, but they can be quite important, especially as you move into the mid-war where DEFCON is 2 and there's not a lot of opportunities for doing coups anymore. Next up, we have the China card. And the China card is an interesting card. It's something which is kind of unique. It's not held in your hand. It essentially starts with the USSR. Once the USSR uses it, then it flips to US control. Now, it can't be used in the same turn that the other side uses it. But basically, this is a card that gets traded back and forth. Once a player plays it, it goes to the other side, who then can use it in a following turn. It's important to note that it's a 4-op card. However, you get 1 more to the operations value when all points are used in Asia. And whoever holds on to the card at the end of the game gets an extra victory point. So it's kind of an interesting card. So yeah, as it says here, you may now possess the China card, but it's face down and unavailable for play at the end of the turn. It will flip face up and you'll be able to play it next turn. There are card events which allow you to steal the China card, and it will either come to your side, either face up or face down according to the event instructions. Then we have this one. So we're going to play Arab-Israeli War, which puts the U.S. position in the Middle East at risk. So this is something which we may not want to play. And so we look at the options. The fourth and final way that we can spend operations points is on a space race attempt. So if you spend the ops points on the space race, the event is not played. So you can only make 1 space race attempt each turn. In general, there's one way that you can play more than 1, but we won't get into that for now. Your current position on the space race track will determine which cards you may use for the space race attempt. And to advance to the next box, you need to play a card worth in this case, 2 ops or more, and then roll between 1 and 3 on a 6-sided die. That will change. The roll will change, or the required operations points will change as well. So we're going to drag the Arab-Israeli War to the space race, and you can see it here. And you can see how the space race progresses. It just requires 2 ops until you get to lunar orbit. Then it requires a 3 ops card for those 2. Space shuttle is only 2 ops, and then it's a 4 ops card to get space station. And also you'll notice the required roll also changes. Now there is also different benefits that you get for advancing to the space race, along the space race. So first of all, you see here Earth satellite, there's 2 victory points for the first player that reaches it, 1 victory point for the second. Man in space gives 2 victory points only to the first person to reach that spot, and so forth. You'll see a couple other spaces here. Also, there are some bonuses. If you are ahead of your opponent on the space race, and you have reached or passed the box, then you get the benefit until the opponent catches up. So Animal in Space gives you the opportunity to play 2 space race cards per turn. That's what I mentioned earlier. Then if you get to man in earth orbit, then the opponent chooses and shows the headline card first. Very powerful ability. So you get to see your opponent's headline before choosing your own. Then eagle or bear has landed. You may discard one held card. So you can just discard a card that you would otherwise hold. It allows you to get rid of some nasty cards you don't want to play. And then finally, if you get to space station, you can take 8 action rounds in a turn, which is pretty powerful. You get more turns than your opponent. So that's great. Okay, so let's see how we do here on the space race. And we roll a 2. So that allows us to advance along the space race. You can see the blue box has advanced. And we get 2 victory points because we're the first player to that spot. And so we avoid playing the event. So the space race is kind of a safety valve for you to play cards that you otherwise would find very awkward to play or difficult to play. You can play them onto the space race provided they reach the op value requirement, and you can play the card on the space race to sort of kick the can down the road. The card may come back later though, just to warn you. So the last card is coup for the USSR, and they're going to coup in Iran, and that's a very good roll. So just to go over this again, so that the operations points is 3. The coup defense is double Iran's stability value of 2, which is 4. So the roll was 5. So it was 8 to 4. So the influence flipped essentially by 4. So we removed the 1 U.S. influence and then added 3 to the USSR influence. So again, with coups, they're safe to take because you're not going to lose influence, unlike realignments. And you can, if you get a good roll, they're pretty effective. So that is a great move for the Soviets. Now they get the military ops points, and they also degrade DEFCON to 3, as you can see here. Oops. So that will then allow us to play the event. Now this is a start event that gives us an extra 1 to the value of our cards. So it's best played early in the turn, obviously, but the Soviets minimized that card and they mitigated it by holding it on to the final action round in the turn. So we only really get the benefit of this for a single action round. So very strong play on the part of the USSR to minimize that event. Okay, and so we get the +1 for this turn. So our cards in hand were worth 1 operations point each, but now whichever one we play is actually going to give us 2 because of the containment event. So we're going to... this is a neutral event that advances us on the space race track. So we may not want to use that. We may want to use that event. So we may want to save those operations points and use it instead on the Romanian abdication. So this gives the event, when played for the USSR, will give enough control or enough influence for control of Romania, and so that will be removed from the game as well. And sometimes you just have to play events that are your opponent's events. Sometimes you just got to grin and bear it and play it and just deal with the consequences because you don't have a choice. So we're going to play this card, and we'll let the opponent take the event first. So we're going to trigger the event first, and that gives 2 influence into Romania, so they've now gained control there. And now we're going to drag the card to place influence, and we're going to place in to work towards Thailand. So Thailand is a battleground country. It's a very key one in Southeast Asia. It's usually very key. So we can't place influence because we don't have any neighboring countries to build on or build from. So we're going to play into Malaysia. And now we have influence in Malaysia. Next turn, we can play into Thailand. You can't chain everything together in one turn. So, because you have to be adjacent at the start of the action. But let's spread out to more to Southeast Asia. Indonesia, it's a low stability country, but only requires 1 influence to control. So that is our turn. And that's the first turn of the game. And so at the end of the turn, we compare military operations to the DEFCON level. So DEFCON is at 3. The U.S. only did one coup worth 2 operations points. So they actually lose a victory point in that case. The Soviets were much better at getting military ops. They got 5. The DEFCON is 3. So they do not lose any victory points. This ends up as a net gain for the Soviets of 1 victory point. Something to remember, especially if you're playing the analog version, something to remember is the doing the mil ops and tracking that. So, okay. And then the containment event disappears and we move into turn 2, which is again the early war. And at the end of every turn, DEFCON improves by 1. So we were at 3 before, it now goes down to 4. And we choose our headline phase here. And at turn 2, we draw enough cards to have 8 in hand. So we had 1 left over from last turn, so we draw 7 new cards. We also have the China card flipped over and available for us to play. And we got a lot of neat cards to play this turn. So we have 9 cards available to us this turn, and we'll choose 1 of them for the headline and then 6 for the action round. So we should have 2 cards left over at the end of our turn. Now, there's only 6 cards left in the draw pile, so the discard pile will be refreshed and reshuffled at the time of the draw pile runs out. Now, one thing that's important to note is that as you get into later turns, so once you enter turn 4, that begins what they call the mid-war, and you have a fresh deck of card events that are mixed into the deck. And the cards are dealt out as usual, and so after turn 7, the last 3 turns are the late war. So you have the late war cards added to the mix as well. So the deck evolves as the game goes on. So a lot of times you'll become very familiar with the early war event cards because they'll be in every game. Sometimes the game will finish before you get to the late war. So this is basically the overview of how to play. Obviously, refer to the rules and poke around, especially if you have this app to play against the AI and just kind of get things figured out. I've tried to cover all of the rules. I'm sure there's a few other little things I've missed, but I hope this was useful in helping you to understand how to play this great game. Thank you so much for watching. This is Legendary Tactics.